J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio. Yep. Are you sick of this topic yet? Well, get used to it. It's going to be around for a while. I want to talk about it in this video because there have been a number of statements recently, a number of things that have been said in the media about this. And we're going to talk about this topic in this video from a number of different perspectives. We're going to talk about the recent reports about an interaction between J.D. Vance and Prime Minister Netanyahu a few weeks ago when Netanyahu was in the States. We're going to talk about what Trump has been saying about Vance and Rubio. We're going to talk about the potential impact of the Iran war on the Vance-Rubio situation and a few other goodies along the way. Let's start with this headline. J.D. Vance and Benjamin Netanyahu had a no BS talk after months of differences, and this happened when Netanyahu was in the States. And Victor Davis Hanson seems to have had some knowledge from behind the scenes of what actually took place or what precipitated this conversation. He seemed to imply that it didn't seem to be talking from conjecture. And I want to play you a clip, a couple of minutes of Victor Davis Hanson talking about J.D. Vance. He was asked about the conversation, the reported tension between J.D. Vance and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So let's take a look at that.
Well, that's a complicated question because Trump came out today and said that he supports JD as his successor as a Republican nominee in 2028. The reason he did that was JD was starting to be associated with these negotiations and not the kinetic part under Hegseth. And the negotiations hadn't worked. And he had said we were dealing with the moderates. There are no moderates in Iran. There's people who pose as moderates, but even if they wanted to be moderate, they'd be murdered. It's run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Everybody knows that, and a theocracy. And then he said that Israel couldn't kill its way out. That sounds like Israel wanted to kill people. They didn't want to kill people. If Hezbollah had stopped the missiles tomorrow, they wouldn't have ever gone into Lebanon. So there was an impression that on the international stage, he wasn't as experienced, let's say, as Rubio, and Rubio's stock was starting to come up. And if that continued, there might be a destructive race in 2028. So what Trump did was he said to JD, pretty much, I will back you, but you've got to stop the stuff about Netanyahu. So he had him meet Netanyahu. And there was supposedly an anime on Laura Ingram's interview. He denied there was a bad. But the problem is this, that Tucker's son worked for JD, and he, whether it's fair or not, is associated with that wing of the MAGA movement, the Tucker Carlson, the Candace Owens, the Steve Bannons, the Joe Kidd, is that his name? Yeah. All of those guys, and maybe Megyn Kelly, I don't know, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey. And the problem with that, if he is to be associated with them, they say some pretty crazy things about Israel and the Jews. And, when Thomas Massey said lost because of the decision was made in Israel, And so there's a lot of, there's two problems with that. Trump's grandchildren are Jewish, and his daughter has converted to Judaism. And more importantly, there's a lot of powerful Jews and donors who are sick of the Democratic anti-Semitism. So the Republican Party is trying to attract them. But already you see, not just among Jews, but among other people, are worried that JD seems to be singling out Israel for criticism that's not applicable to other more deserving targets.
All right, Victor.
Let's get rid of that. Okay. So that's interesting. He said there that Trump basically told JD, you got to knock it off with the anti-Israel, the anti-Israel conspiracy theories or leveling criticisms that are unfounded. There are not criticisms of Israel are fine. Israelis criticize Israel a lot. It's when there's unfounded criticisms, saying things like J.D. Vance has said, and I've talked about this in some other videos about J.D. Vance, some of the unfair criticisms he's leveled at Israel. But look at what Victor Davis Hanson says here, that Trump actually wants Vance And he did recently reportedly say that he wants Vance, but he needs him to change his tone about Jews and about Israel, because there's a lot of people, as much as, Vance is confident maybe that the younger part of the MAGA movement is more in that direction, more isolationist, more anti-Israel. That could be. But there's still a lot of voters. The bulk of the voters really are in the pro-Israel camp in the Republican Party. And, there's a lot of people scratching their heads about J.D. Vance lately, and Trump wants to correct that. So that's what Victor Davis Hanson said that was about. Now, before we go on with anything else, I want to talk about the webinar on Sunday. We gotta plug the webinar. If you're not registered, please register for this. It is taking place on Sunday, this coming Sunday, August 16th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. in Israel. And if you can't make it, still register, because you will get an email to your inbox with the full webinar. Subject is Mamdani's New York City, a warning to America. We have former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, the young commentator and public intellectual, Shabbos Kestenbaum, Ariella Novak, who is an investigative journalist who is a frequent contributor for Fox News and for JNS. She's been covering the Mamdani situation. The great author on Islam, Robert Spencer, and Rabbi Daniel Schombach, who has been at the forefront of coalition building to push back on Mamdani's disastrous policies. It's going to be a great webinar this coming Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. in Israel. Should run about an hour to an hour and a half, probably about an hour and a half in total. And you can register by going to the link in the description of this video, or go to israel365.com/Mamdani, or scan the QR code that is on your screen. You don't want to miss it this coming Sunday. All right, let's get rid of all that. So that was Victor Davis Hanson's take. I want to show you something that was written in the Washington Post just about a week ago. Okay, so we have this story here. Trump privately tells donors to back Vance while publicly keeping 2028 open, meaning publicly Trump is not endorsing anyone, but privately he tells donors. What does it say here? President Donald Trump recently told donors in private that he wants to see his vice president win the 2028 presidential election, a sign that he is open to publicly backing J.D. Vance, even as some advisors caution that Trump has yet to settle firmly on a successor. Quote, "At the end of the day, we need to elect J.D.," Trump said during an Oval Office meeting with donors roughly 2 weeks ago, according to two people with knowledge of the comments who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter. Even as Trump buoyed his vice president to donors in the Oval Office, though, he was still peppering people around him with questions about Vance versus Rubio. One White House official said the president quizzed staff about the two men on a Marine One ride last month. An advisor to the president with direct knowledge of Trump's comment to the donors said that Trump has privately resolved that Vance will be the heir to the GOP, but that it is, quote, too early to determine when Vance will announce his candidacy or when Trump will publicly endorse him. 6 other Trump world advisors and allies, however, cautioned that they aren't convinced the president has settled on Vance, noting that Trump tells different things to different people and could still change his mind about an endorsement for 2028. Trump aides widely agree that the president will delay endorsing to avoid appearing to be a lame duck. That's an interesting factor. At whatever point Trump endorses someone who's running for president, he appears to be more of a lame duck. That's a good point. Never thought of that. Quote, "Anyone assuming it's a lock is just getting way ahead of themselves or just doesn't know the president very well," said an official with knowledge of Trump's recent Vance-Rubio poll on Marine One. During the 2024 running mate contest and now, Rubio had the backing of most pre-Trump GOP donors. Vance is more aligned with the younger MAGA coalition that returned Trump to power in 2024, but is now at risk of fraying. He has also spent his vice presidency developing relationships with party benefactors to fundraise for the GOP. And you think back to what Victor Davis Hanson said, that Vance is very much seen as aligned with a piece of the GOP that is not really a traditional part of the GOP, this Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene faction that are now breaking off and starting their own party. That's a bad look for Vance. Does he actually break with them publicly or not? Interesting question. Quote, Vance has done a lot of political work in the last year and a half, said the Trump advisor with knowledge of his recent comment to donors, meaning Vance is trying to work more to court the donor class. Very smart. Lately, Vance impressed Trump by negotiating a June ceasefire deal with Iran, leading a task force to crack down on fraud and federal benefits, and parrying a range of media interviews for his book tour in June, the advisor said. Even though the ceasefire deal collapsed in July, Vance advisors believe that his role in the talks was still a political win. The agreement he negotiated was popular, whereas voters widely disapprove of Trump's handling of the war, meaning that's an interesting point. And there's some truth to it. I'm not a big fan of the Washington Post. But they're saying that even though the MOU that Vance was the face of collapsed, the MOU was actually popular. People wanted some sort of agreement. They don't want the war to be on. So that's still, it might still have been a political win for Vance. Interesting. Rubio, by contrast, has served in multiple key administration roles, none of which lend themselves to politics. Legally and logistically, a Secretary of State or a national security advisor, a role Rubio also occupies, would not be able to run for president while serving. Rubio does not have a campaign in waiting or a political operation ready to assemble. The Trump advisor said that Trump still would like to see Rubio on a joint ticket with Vance, and the president regularly praises Rubio, but that it is unclear whether Rubio would actually want the role of Vance's running mate. A Rubio spokesman declined to comment. Let's remember what a young politician Vance actually is. Okay, he served all of 1.5 years barely in the Senate before being named a VP candidate, which kind of ended his Senate term. He was just then campaigning as VP, as a running mate to Trump. That's his whole political career. So, I mean, he could end up being the Republican Obama, like there's a political novice. I'll get into that at the end of this video. I'll have some other comments to say. And then we have this from a little more than a week ago. Rubio leads Vance by 36 points in new 2028 GOP straw poll. This isn't the whole GOP. It's just, it's an event. It's anecdotal. Secretary of State Marco Rubio captured a strong majority of conservatives participating in a 2028 GOP presidential straw poll over the weekend, finishing 36 points ahead of Vice President Vance. The survey of attendees at the Western Conservative Summit in Colorado found that 57% of the 500-plus respondents backed Rubio, who led a group of 27 Republican and Democratic candidates. Vance, in second, received support from 21% of the attendees. I bet this was an older crowd. I'm just saying. Former Vice President Mike Pence, Libertarian Representative Thomas Massie, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis rounded out the top five. Regarding whom attendees approved of heading into 2028, just 3 Republicans received support from a majority. Rubio at 85%, Vance at 71%, and DeSantis at 55%. Trump also floated a Vance-Rubio ticket in June. The president said a combination of Vance, a populist, and Rubio, who has traditional conservative credentials, would be a great team. Quote, I don't know how you'd beat them if they're together, he told Miranda Devine, the reporter from the New York Post, on an episode of the New York Post's Pod Force One. So we know where Trump is. And this is, and we see that, the GOP activists, the GOP donors, not just the donors, but the activists the ones who skew older for sure, are definitely more in the Rubio camp. And the New York Times, a few weeks ago, end of July, ran an opinion piece by their columnist Ross Douthat. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to get to what he says at the end because I found it interesting. And this is where we pivot to talking about the impact of the Iran war. We already alluded to it in the piece in the Washington Post about how the MOU, how Vance doing the negotiation, the deal with Iran affects his candidacy. But look at this. This is a very interesting passage in this opinion piece. First, even among growing doubts about the conflict, meaning with Iran, most of the Republican base doesn't want to be told that the president made a terrible mistake going to war in the first place, and a vice president can't campaign that way regardless, meaning Vance is the vice president. He can't go out and campaign that Trump made a mistake. And by the way, this brings up a whole other issue, which is the role that Trump is going to play in the campaign, because he's not going to shut up. Trump is not a conventional man. Most presidents, when they're done, they vanish from public life for a while. Obama didn't. but he mostly did. You don't see him all the time. We can expect Trump to still be pretty vocal. He'll be talking about the policies of the next president nonstop. It's hard to imagine he won't. And certainly in this campaign, he's still going to be president during the campaign. He's going to be asked about it all the time. He's going to open his mouth. I cannot see how Vance can be criticizing Trump in that campaign. It's not going to work, right? And since Vance can't campaign that way because he has to defend his boss, his position won't be fully satisfying to the anti-war right either, whether embodied by Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan, meaning that group won't be able to get behind Vance if Vance is praising Trump, and Vance is going to have a hard time going against Trump, even though everyone knew that he wasn't so for the Iran war. It's going to be very tricky to watch. I thought this was a very interesting point. This dilemma could have been resolved by a Vance peace deal, letting the VP credit Trump with his supposed victory while earning his own credit for deal making from those who see things clearly. But obviously the efforts to end the war have not succeeded yet. And the June Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran, mainly negotiated by Vance, is currently bobbing. This is a few weeks ago. It's done. Bullets strafed in the Strait of Hormuz. So you could argue that he's not trapped betwixt and between, that he's now trapped betwixt and between a scapegoat for the hawks who think the administration hasn't been tough enough, but not successful enough diplomatically to satisfy conservatives looking for a peacemaker. But the challenge for the anti-Vance voices is that it's not enough to have a story where the Iran war where the Iran war has created various political problems for him. You need a story where he is so weakened that Trump himself decides to favor Rubio as a successor, because there's no way that the Secretary of State campaigns against the vice president without Trump's tacit blessing. Good point. Such a story was imaginable at the start of the war if it had gone well. Vance's opposition had looked foolish, and Rubio had then positioned himself as the champion of a successful hawkish foreign policy. You could have imagined then Rubio rising to the top, Trump and Trump endorsing him. But from where we are right now, the position of difficulty and stalemate, there's no evidence that Trump regards Vance more skeptically because of his initial opposition to the war. Indeed, there's reporting that the president has warmed to the vice president over the past few months, and albeit with Vance's weight loss given partial credit for the shift, and some of Vance's most controversy-courting comments on the war, his critiques of Israel's posture especially, almost certainly reflect the president's own frustrations, maybe somewhat. So how would you get from here to a world where Rubio becomes the heir apparent? If the war, meaning what's the pathway where Rubio really becomes the guy? That's an interesting question. Here's what he suggests. If the war grinds on in stalemate and ends in embarrassment for America, I cannot imagine a successful Republican primary campaign being waged on the premise that J.D. Vance is too dovish or anti-interventionist. If Trump ramps up the hostilities and the war becomes an even bigger debacle, that's bad for all his would-be heirs, but hardly a boon for the dump Vance movement, which leaves only a scenario where Trump sharply escalates, his vice president opposes the escalation, while the Secretary of State champions it, and the Iranian regime collapses and gas prices with it, leaving Trump with Rubio to thank for victory and Vance to blame for standing in the way. That's the future where I might bet on Rubio for 2028, but it's also not a future I would bet on happening. That's the fairy tale that we tell ourselves that we hope will happen. Maybe it's not a fairy tale, maybe it will happen. But he raises in this article, he does a great job of laying out the dilemmas that are in there in what role how the Iran war is going to turn out impacts this whole question of Vance versus Rubio. It's absolutely fascinating. And he brings up some interesting points. We think of Vance as the anti-Iran camp, but he won't be able to campaign on, I was opposed to what Trump did. He's going to have a very hard time campaigning on that with Trump in the Oval Office during the campaign and Trump being Trump and needing that endorsement. It's going to be very, very interesting to watch that. And finally, I'll leave you, we'll play this before I share my final thoughts. And this is a clip that's making the rounds of Ben Shapiro on the Patrick Bet David, the PBD podcast. And this was I think yesterday, and this is a very short clip, just under 2 minutes. Here we go.
You buy any of those stories that Rubio may not even run?
Yes.
You believe that?
Yes.
Why do you believe that?
Because I think that the Secretary of State, again, he may well run, but I think it is unlikely in my own personal perspective, because if you look at his political history, he's a pretty risk-averse politician. So if you're Marco and you're looking at sort of the gaming out what the next few years look like for you, here are your choices. You run against JD, you lose, you're done. You run against JD, you win. It's a rough election cycle anyway, because the president's riding in the 30s and the country is in the mood for, quote unquote, something new, and you lose, you're done. You don't run, JD may pick you as his VP candidate. JD loses, you're next. JD does not pick you and JD loses, you're also next. So if you're sort of doing a prisoner's dilemma here, in a game theory prisoner's dilemma, I think that the prisoner's dilemma suggests that Rubio will probably not run out of risk aversion. Because
that would be a shame if that happens.
I mean, I agree. I would like to see an open and robust debate on the stage between all of these various positions where people are actually held to account for their positions, because I prefer clarity.
Kalshi's got DeSantis third. Who do they have next? Is there anybody else after DeSantis?
I mean, DeSantis all the way down at 4.6,
yeah,
right?
4.6.
And Donald Trump Jr. is not running.
Tucker 3.5.
Right.
So
and then back to Trump, who constitutionally cannot run.
He's so funny. He says, "I'm here to announce my." 2 weeks ago, he's so funny. So okay, so DeSantis, no chance. You think this is a Rubio, JD thing? And
listen, a lot can happen. It's still early. But again, if I were going to put my money on it, if I were in the Kalshi markets, I'd put my money on Vance.
Yeah, so Ben Shapiro there brings up a very, very interesting argument. Very interesting argument for why Marco Rubio won't run. He says it's a lose-lose. He sees this as a very difficult election cycle for the Republicans. Maybe yes, maybe no. Depends. I think some of it depends on whether the Save America Act gets passed, because my personal belief is that the Democrats cannot win if the Save America Act gets passed, and if there's voter ID is required everywhere in America. Kamala Harris only won states, as far as I know. She only won states where voter ID was not a requirement. So I don't know. I don't know if Ben's analysis is correct, that it's going to be such a tough election cycle that the likelihood is that the Republican candidate loses, because that's one of the premises of what he was arguing. But it's a very interesting argument he makes there. Marco Rubio is still young. So is JD Vance, but Marco Rubio is still young. Why should he jump the gun at this point? He's doing well as Secretary of State. Wait it out. Does he want to be the vice president to JD Vance, the vice presidential candidate, and then Vance loses? Okay, he can still run. You can be a vice presidential candidate and later run for president, especially with Rubio's resume. But if he runs against Vance in the primary and loses, that's a disaster. Running against Vance in the primary now versus running against whoever will come after Vance in a primary later, he might be better off waiting. Interesting. But is this calculation correct? I don't know. I'll tell you what I think about JD Vance. I've said it in other interviews. I might have said it on my channel already. I alluded to it earlier about his political inexperience. But there's something else, which is about our misunderstanding of how much personality plays a role. You see, even if JD Vance and or Marco Rubio are totally aligned with Trump on policy, Ronald Reagan famously, championed the expression that personnel is policy. But let me go a little further. Personality is policy. Without Trump's brash personality, without his sense that he knows better than everybody, he could have all the experts in the world in the room and he knows better than them, which seems to be sometimes like an insane and negative personality trait, is also his best trait. Simultaneously, it's both his worst trait and his best trait. I think that's true of a lot of all of us, that our worst traits are often just a different application of our best traits. And Trump is he spent his whole life being an entrepreneur, making deals, thinking out of the box. Entrepreneurs tend to think out of the box and take risks, and being very confident about that for years and years, decades and decades and decades, having all that success. And that's what gives him the confidence and the brashness to go in there and do things like move the embassy to Jerusalem, even though all the experts told him it would be a disaster, and it wasn't. And making these massive changes and the things that he's, all the initiatives also in foreign policy and domestic policy, the big changes that Trump makes all come from that personality. Look at the resume of J.D. Vance. The resume is, as far as I know, right, he went to Yale, like he served in the Marines, he went to Yale Law School. He worked for Peter Thiel. He wrote a book, a best-selling novel, a memoir, and then he runs for Senate. He was like running third in that campaign. Then Trump endorsed him, and he ended up winning. My point being that he hasn't spent a career building anything. He didn't even serve in. He didn't run many campaigns and take other risks. He didn't have people employed by him. He didn't build a business. I'm not talking about, it's not, again, you have presidents who are not businessmen who are very good presidents, but he didn't. I don't see someone who has the traits. When we think about comparison to Trump, Vance is a very different person. In fact, to me, he's the perfect profile of someone who, if he gets elected president, he's very articulate and he definitely has ideas and policy ideas and things he believes in. But he's the kind of person who will trust his advisors. He'll trust the experts that he puts around him, and he'll be the front man for sure. But I think it's actually very different from President Trump, who is such an independent thinker that even with all these, he has experts in front of him, but he's really the one who's being decisive. People who don't necessarily trust their own knowledge and their own experience will defer to experts. That tends to be what they do. It's the wise thing to do. And that's why, through no fault of JD's, I just don't think that he's someone that I would want in that position. That's my thought about him. And nothing to do with the Israel stuff and all that. I think there's other issues there. And in the end of the day, the Pentagon has a lot to say about U.S.-Israel relations, and so does the Senate and the Congress. And I don't want to make too much of JD's comments. I have talked about them in the past. I'm not happy with them. I think they're a lack of judgment. But to me, the biggest issue with JD Vance potentially being president is just the lack of political maturity. That is just, again, not his own fault. It's just, if you look at the career trajectory, he's not someone I would feel comfortable with as president of the United States. That's my thoughts. All right. Thanks for watching. And we'll do some more of these tomorrow. God bless.